Hi and welcome to this NPTEL course titled Trauma and Literature, where we're looking at Urvashi Butalia's The Other Side of Silence. We have already started with the text, so we'll just go on from where we left last time. And this should be on the screen. So if you remember the opening of this book, we have the writer Butalia going to Lahore to reconnect to her relatives, people that she had been disconnected to due to partition. And the whole idea, of course, is to go back in time, because we were talking about how going back in space is also going back in time. So in a sense, it's also time travel, right? So she's going back to reconnect to her roots. And of course, it's a very strange experience because she, on the one hand, she's connecting to people that she's tied to in terms of kinship, but then she's also untied from or disconnected from in terms of the cartographic constructs which followed the partition. So we're looking at how the cartographic disconnect after partition and the sort of the kinship which was there previously prior to that, those are very incompatible with each other. And this incompatibility is interesting for us to examine because, on the one hand, there are two different nation states, but on the other hand, there's this emotional connect, going back and reconnecting to people that you're emotionally and even in terms of a family kinship system connected to. Okay, so now she talks about the practical difficulties that she faces in Pakistan as an Indian citizen, and how things are difficult bureaucratically as well as in terms of paperwork. So this should be on your screen. Crossing the border into Pakistan had been easier than I thought. Getting a visa was difficult, though ironically, the visa office at the Pakistan High Commission ran two separate counters. One for people they call foreigners and the other for Indians, right? So Indians belong to a different category in the visa office in Pakistan, right? The Pakistan High Commission, because obviously, presumably the Indian applicants will have to go through more complex procedural methods in terms of getting a visa, the Pakistan visa. At the latter, crowds of people jostled and pushed, trying to get together all the necessary paperwork, while outside an old man, balding and half bent at the waist, offered to take instant photos, using a small bucket of developer to get them ready. Once over the border, however, everything looked familiar at the airport. The same chaos, the same language, the same smells, the same clothes, right? So this is a very interesting juxtaposition of sameness and difference that we see, because politically they're different countries, cartographically they're different countries, and we are also told that getting a visa, a Pakistan visa, is a difficult process, and there's complete chaos and pandemonium at the counter, and the people jostling and elbowing each other, and someone offering to take a photograph. So it's a complete chaos. But once you cross the border, everything looks very familiar. So we are looking at this very interesting interplay of familiarity and difference, right? Because on the one hand, these are people who have just been separated cartographically through a political process, but then these are people who also had been living together for the longest time. They share a lot. They share a common language. They share a common culture, to a great extent. They share common clothes, common food. So once she crosses the border, everything looks very familiar. So in Pakistan, people are speaking the same kind of language as she's used to in the northern part of India. Okay, so this is something that she sees. Once over the border, however, everything looked familiar at the airport. The same chaos, the same language, the same smells, the same clothes. What I was not prepared for, however, was a strong emotional pull that came with the crossing, right? So there seems to be some kind of emotional kinship, an emotional affiliation that she's experiencing once she crosses over to Pakistan. And this is something that she had not anticipated, right? So the emotional pull that came with the crossing, and this was something she was not prepared for. I felt there was no other word for it, a sense of having come home, right? And this is a very important concept over here, home. Home over here is less a cartographic construct, is less an address, and more of a feeling. It's more of an experiential location, right? So experientially she feels connected. Experientially she feels like coming home, right? Because there is, as I mentioned, these are cultures and landmasses and people who had been living together for the longest time, and who have been disconnected, due to the political process of partition. But now she's crossed the border, so that border becomes a symbolic liminal territory. She's crossed it, but once she crosses it, she feels that she's coming home. So there's a sense of nostalgia about it. And also remember, we are talking about what we call post-memory, right? So post-memory is a phenomenon, is that kind of memory, the modality of memory whereby a human subject consumes memory from the early generations. So she hasn't experienced partition firsthand, but she's consumed the knowledge of partition, she's consumed the memory of partition, having been told the stories of partition over and over again by her ancestors, by her family relatives, right? So this is how she's a post-memory generation. And I kept asking myself, why? So why does she feel at home? Why does she feel this sort of homely feeling, this homeliness, while she crosses a border and moves into Pakistan? And I kept asking myself, why? I was born 5 years after partition. What did I know of the history of pain and anguish that had dogged the lives of my parents and grandparents? Why should this place, which I'd never seen before, seem more like home than Delhi, where I had lived practically all my life, right? So this is the classic post-memory scenario where she's experiencing some kind of a kinship, some kind of a affiliation based on the memory that she's consumed, which has come down to her intergenerationally, right? And this intergenerational consumption of memory is something that she is describing in great details here. Right, so she's obviously born 5 years after partition, and she was raised practically entire life in Delhi. So why does she feel this kinship in Lahore? Why does she feel this kinship while she crosses the border? Right, so what is about the space? So we're talking about not just physical geography, but also emotional geography, and that's a very important concept, especially in memory studies, emotional geography. So, the relationship between emotions and different kinds of spaces, and what happens when you entangle the space and the emotion together. Right, so Lahore to her seems more homely than Delhi, the place where she grew up physically. Okay, so what was this strange trajectory of histories and stories that had made it seem so important for me to come here? Standing there in the veranda of my uncle's house, I remember thinking, perhaps for the first time, that this was something unexpected. When I had begun my search, I wasn't sure what I would find, but I wasn't prepared for what I did find. This was something no history lesson had prepared me for. These people, strangers that I had met practically that instant, were treating me like family, but actually the frontier that divided us went so deep that everywhere you looked, in religion, in politics, in geography, and history, it reared its ugly head and mocked those little attempts at overcoming the divide, right? So we're talking about the divide in a physical sense. We're talking about the divide in a cartographic sense, the divide which has been done, the partition which has been done, and something which is always there as a very strong physical presence. Now, contrast to that, we have this emotional kinship. We have these people who are otherwise strangers, but they feel immediately connected, instantly connected to each other in very, very cordial and very emotional ways, right? And this emotional connect completely undercuts the cartographic divide. So again, we're looking at emotional geography superseding physical geography. So physical geography, the two nation states, which has a partition in between them, that becomes secondary over here. And the emotional connect that these two people have, having grown up together, having lived together for generations. So despite the fact that the writer, Urvashi Butalia, had never been in Pakistan before, never been in that part of the world before, she feels that connect, almost like a genetic connect, because her entire lineage comes from that area, right? So this is the emotional geography we're talking about. Okay, Rana Mama, outside whose house I stood that night, is my mother's youngest brother, right? So this is the uncle that she's talking about, Rana Mama. Like many North Indian families, ours too was divided at partition. So now we get to know the family history of her. My mother, who was still single at the time, found herself on the Indian side of the border. Rana Mama, her brother, chose to stay behind. According to my mother and her other siblings, his choice was a motivated one. He wanted access to the property my grandfather, who was no longer alive, owned. With all the other family contenders out of the way, he could be sole owner of it. Because of this, and because of the near impossibility of keeping in touch after partition, the family lost contact with Rana Mama. For 40 years, no one communicated with him, heard from him, or saw anything of him, until, that is, I went to see him. So we see how something which is very familial and domestic and almost petty in terms of who's going to have access, who's going to have ownership on an ancestral house, that becomes the motivating factor in terms of who will stay behind in Pakistan and who will go to India. So this person, her uncle, her mother's own brother, chose to stay back because he had an eye on the property, presumably, and he wanted the property because everyone else was going to India. So as the only person who stayed behind, he inherited the property. So that was obviously, that created some divide emotionally as well between other members of the family. And then, of course, the big cartographic divide happened, as a result of which there was no contact. Everyone lost contact with Rana Mama. And as you can see, the word loss comes in a single quote, right? So which means, obviously, that there is some kind of a complexity in this loss. So, they chose to lose contact in a certain sense. Until, that is, I went to see him. So she, the intergeneration, the second generation person, goes back almost in space and time. As I mentioned, there's also a bit of a time traveling involved over here. Goes back and then reconnects to him. Okay, and now we have a very interesting and beautiful example and description of this sort of post-memory, as in the consumption of memory through stories, which are sort of handed down to someone who was never otherwise experienced the real event. But the only access they have to the event is through stories, is through the accounts told and shared with them by other family members. Ever since I can remember, we had heard stories of partition from my grandmother, my father's mother, who lived with us, and from my parents, who had both lived through it very differently. In the way that I heard, vaguely registered several of the stories, I had also registered Rana. So Rana Mama or Rana Uncle is the person whose house she's visiting at the moment in Lahore. Right? So she had heard stories about Rana, and obviously, on hearing the stories, she had projected some picture of him in her mind. Not only had he stayed back, but worse, and I suspect this was what made him a person non grata in our family, he had become a Muslim, right? So again, this religious conversion is further accentuated the divide, right? Because he chose to become a Muslim, he had become a Muslim, and as a result of which he became a person of insignificance, person non grata, non-acknowledged, right? He had become a Muslim. My mother made two difficult and dangerous journeys amidst the worst communal violence to Lahore to fetch her family to India. The first time she brought her younger brother, Bilo, and her sister, Savita. The second time she went to fetch her mother and Rana, the youngest. Her father had long since died. But she said Rana refused to come, and he wasn't willing to let my grandmother go either. He denied that he wanted to hold on to her for the sake of my grandfather's property, which was in her name, and he promised to bring her to India soon. This never happened. So again, we can see almost the accounts of the petty domestic differences and how that is sort of mapped onto the bigger difference of partition. So again, the small micro stories of human emotion, human difference, human pettiness, human quarrel, and that is sort of mapped onto the bigger story of partition, right? So that becomes interesting micro narrative journey along with the bigger narrative. Okay. So we give in detailed accounts of why Rana Mama did not come and what was the stake for him. He wanted the property. He kept his mother, that is Urvashi Butalia's grandmother, just so he could access the property through her. And he became a Muslim. So all these little stories around the family certainly become important because these become the subtext to the bigger story of partition that she's trying to access and retell and re-experience as well. So once the country was divided, it became virtually impossible for people of different communities to move freely in the other country. So the word other again appears in a single quote. So the otherness, the national otherness, the cartographic otherness, the cultural otherness, the political other, apropos of each other. So India is the political other of Pakistan, and Pakistan is in the political other of India. And that other, or that sense of otherness, obviously creates a sense of estrangement as well, right? So that estrangement is political as well as emotional in quality. And of course, by crossing the political partition, by crossing the political border, she's also crossed the emotional border, and now she feels connected to the family again. Right? But we at this point in time, we get to hear the backstory of what had happened to her family. Okay, so it was divided, and it was virtually impossible for people of different communities to move freely in the other country, except for a few who were privileged and had access to people in power, a circumstance that ensured relatively smooth passage. Most people were unable to get back to their homes, which had often been left behind in a hurry. So in a hurry of partition, people had left behind their homes, But once the partition had happened, once the borders were defined and the two nation states were declared, it was virtually impossible for people to go back to their homes and reclaim it. It was politically and bureaucratically impossible, as well as there were other dangers as well. And the other dangers constitute a suspicion, and this is what she says. There was a deep suspicion on both sides, and any cross-border movement was watched and monitored by the police and the intelligence. Rana and his family kept contact for some time, but found themselves constantly under surveillance, with their letters being opened and questions being asked. After a while, they simply gave up trying to communicate. And for 40 years, it remained that way. Although Rana remained in my grandfather's house, no one spoke or wrote to him, and no one heard from him in all these years. Sometime during the time, it was in 1947 that my family heard unconfirmed reports that my grandmother had died. But no one really knew. The sense of deep loss of family, mother, home gave way to bitterness and resentment, and finally to indifference. Perhaps it was this last that communicated itself to us when, as children, we listened to stories of partition and a family's history. Now, this is a very important emotional sequence, as you can see. The sense of loss. So there was this rumored report that a grandmother had died, but of course there was no way to confirm it. There's no telephone, there was no way you could write a letter and get a confirmed report. But there was this half-formed or half-confirmed report about the grandmother's demise. And that created bitterness, that created a sort of vague sense of bitterness, because you're not quite sure if that's true or not, but then at the same time, you are sad about it, because you think that has happened and your family member has died. So the sense of deep loss, and again, notice the sequence, the sense of deep loss gave way to bitterness, anger, resentment, further anger, and finally to indifference. So this sort of, at the end, is just exhausted of all emotions and just becomes indifference. Now, if you remember, I will quickly connect you to the novel that we just finished prior to this, which is Catch-22. Now, Catch-22 extends the indifference further until it becomes laughter, right? So there was tragedy, there's resentment, there's bitterness, there's anger, there's pain, there's anguish, and finally it just gets exhausted and it becomes indifferent, and then it extends further and it becomes laughter. And this laughter is not happy laughter. This is a laughter of exhaustion. This is a laughter which is almost a physical reflex, a physical reaction to tragedy, right? Because you're so numbed and to react in a way which is tragic, you just laugh about it and produce a dark humor about it, which is what the story was all about, if you remember Catch-22. But over here too, we have a similar sequence of emotions. So indifference is just, at the end, everyone's just indifferent. Perhaps it was this last that communicated itself to us, right? So, stories that were told to us were indifferent stories. When as children, we listened to stories of partition and a family's history, right? So again, the family story and the partition story sort of mapped into each other in ways which are complex as well as incompatible, right? So the compatibility / incompatibility between the family story, the human story, the emotional story, and the bigger political stories, that forms the basis of the experience of partition, especially for a sort of post-memory generation like Urvashi Butalia. Okay, so and we cut back into the present. At midnight, the phone rang in my friend Farida's house, which is the house where she is living at the moment. We were deep in conversation and gossip over cups of coffee and the salt/sweet tea. The Pakistanis call kawa, right? So kawa is a kind of tea, and even in Kashmir they call kawa. It's a kind of tea which is produced in that part of India and Pakistan, so the northern part of India. And if you go over to Pakistan, they have a similar kind of tea as well. It's called kawa. She listened somewhat distractedly to the phone for a minute. Who could be calling at this time? And handed it to me, suddenly excited, saying, "It's your uncle." So Rana Mama, the uncle Rana, has called her. As Farida had answered the phone, a male voice on the other side had said, apparently without preamble, "I believe my daughter is staying with you. Please call my daughter. I would like to speak to her." "Betty," he said to me as I tentatively greeted him, "what are you doing there? This is your home. You must come home at once and you must stay here. Give me your address and I'll come and pick you up." No preamble, no greeting, just a direct, no-nonsense picking up of family ties. I was both touched and taken aback, right? So this is the emotional reconnect that she's talking about. The moment she goes back, it's almost like time travel. It's almost as if nothing had happened in the interim period and she just belongs there. So he just picks up the phone, calls a friend in whose house she's staying, and asks her to just come, almost orders her to come back and stay at her home, which is the place where he is. Okay, so I was both touched and taken aback. We talked and argued. Finally, I managed to dissuade him. It was late. He was tired. Why didn't we just meet in the morning? I'd get my friend to bring me over. I'm not settled for just meeting, he told me. Don't think you can get away from here. This is your home, and this is where you must stay with your family, right? So again, we're talking about emotional geographies over here. So this house, which is notionally in Lahore, which is notionally a different nation, is suddenly home to her, because that's the house where her ancestors grew up in. And again, this is a bit of a time travel. So you can see how space and time begin to merge together, and what we called chronotop in memory studies. Chronotop is a concept used by Mikhail Bakhtin. It's a literary device where time and space come together. Chrono is time, chronological. Top is some topography, a topo space. So space and time put together in one capsule, right? So this chronotop becomes the memory chronotop for her, and she's asked to go back and stay there, as if partition had never happened, right? So this is also some sense of time traveling. So come and stay with us. This is your home. This is your family. Home, family. I remember thinking these were strange words between two people who hardly knew each other. Ought I go and stay with him? I was tempted, but I was also uncertain. How could I pack my bags and go off to stay with someone I don't know, even if there was a family connection? The next morning, I went minus bags. He remarked on it instantly. Where is your luggage? Later that evening, he came with me to Farida's house. I picked up my bags and we went back together to his home. So again, she's asked to go back to the home where her ancestors, the family, grew up together before the partition happened. So as you can see, partition over here becomes less of a physical divide and more of an emotional divide. And now that she's crossed the border again, the emotional ties are reestablished and reconnected. I stayed with my uncle for a week. All the time I was aware of and underlying sense of betrayal. My mother had no wish to reopen contact with her brother, whom she suspected of being mercenary and scheming. Why else, she asked, had he stayed back, held on to the property and to the one person to whom it belonged, my grandmother? So again, the pettiness of family stories, the pettiness of family difference is sort of mapped onto the bigger picture of partition, as you can see. Over the years, her bitterness and resentment had only increased, but given my own political trajectory, this visit meant too much to me to abandon. And once I had seen my uncle and been addressed by him as a daughter, it became even more difficult to opt out. So I stayed in that big, rambling Haveli. Haveli is this magnificent mansion, big, huge mansion. And for a week we talked. It was an intense and emotionally draining week. For a long time afterwards, I found it difficult to talk about that parenthetical time in my life. I remember registering various presences, my aunt, my younger and older cousins, food, sleep, all somewhat vaguely. The only recollection that remains sharp and crystal clear is of the many conversations my uncle and I had. So I stop at this point today, but what I'd like to emphasize a little bit here is the idea of this parenthetical time. So this parenthetical time seems to be almost outside of clock time, almost outside of historical time. So this is some old time which has been dug up again, and she's inhabiting it. So this literally becomes some kind of a time traveling thing, right? So she goes back in time, parenthetical time, some kind of a liminal connecting time, and she's trying to recover the lost time or redeem the lost time. And it is so loaded in terms of memory that she doesn't quite remember what had happened. She just remembers impressions and faces and people. But the only recollection that she has, which has stayed crystal clear and very sharp in her mind, are the many conversations that she had with her uncle. And of course, these conversations, these stories, these narratives are stories about reconnecting, stories that stitch back the past and the present. So I'm using the word stitch quite literally. It's like weaving them together, tying different orders of time in true stories, true experiences, true narratives, right? So these become quite literally experiences of redemption, experiences of reconnect, which transcend to a certain extent the physical divide of two different nation states. So I'll stop at this point today and we'll just carry on from this in the next lecture. Thank you for your attention.